we are deeply alarmed and saddened by the recent reports of Immigration and Custom Enforcements, known as ICE, raids taking place across California, specifically Southern California. These operations, often conducted with little notice and executed with militarized tactics, tear families apart, sow fear in immigrant communities, and criminalize people whose only offense is seeking a better life. With today's social media presence, many confrontations and interactions were filmed for the rest of the world to see. Some of you might have seen a few videos circling around social media, especially Instagram and TikTok, where people filming were mentioning the last names of agents who did have badges. Because let's get our facts straight, not all agents were identifiable, and many credible reports have indicated the lack of ID badges on agents. In the videos that I am referring to, they were focusing on individuals with Latinx last names such as Vasquez, Hernandez, Ramirez, etc. This begs the question, how many of our Latinx brothers, sons, uncles, fathers, friends are currently involved in ICE or Border Patrol agencies? Because from their inception, those agencies have always targeted people of color. These are also agencies that were predominantly white and now are the most ethically and racially diverse than ever. How did this happen? In this episode, we dive into the discovery of the patterns of recruitment of our Latinx men, specifically our children of immigrants, into law enforcement and military. But before we get started, it is important that we say this with our whole chest. To our immigrant communities, we see you, we stand with you, you deserve safety, you deserve respect, and you deserve justice. So, Prima, with that being said, I'm going to kick off this podcast with the question. I know I kind of mentioned it in my statement, but who is operating these missions or orders that are currently happening across our country, but more specifically in Southern California?
Prima. So oftentimes it is these agencies who have significant power and who use excessive force. And as mentioned, Prima, within your statement, as you said, oftentimes it is our own people who are in these agencies, right, who are doing the harm. So today we are going to dive into what this all means when it comes to these agencies recruiting our own people, to the training that they are given, the stats of how this violence is perpetrated within these agencies.
Well, thank you, Prima. And with that, primos and primas, welcome to your favorite podcast. My name is Andrea, and I am joined with my prima and my co-host.
Hi, everybody. I am Jack. I am the other prima, and welcome to our podcast, Ponle Acento.
Right on. So I am going to say one thing that has been I guess it's been a rooted reality for me these last few weeks and months, which is two things can be true at once. And I think for me, whenever I say that statement, it allows me to acknowledge that the world and our values and layers and identities, they're not just black and white. Like two things can coexist at once. And so leading into this episode, I want to say it is true that these agencies, both law enforcement and military, have been rooted in hate and racism, colorism, and also true that individuals growing up in communities with really low resources and opportunities can also, without knowing, decide to join these agencies because they see that way out. So I do want to acknowledge that we can decipher two things at the same time, where we say, yes, these agencies are rooted in racism and hatred. And yes, sometimes individuals feel like there's no way out. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with asking you, Prima, what are the recruitment tactics that we typically see from our military, from maybe like our police academies, from border patrols, really anything that encompasses like a law enforcement. What are those recruitment tactics that are being used?
Yeah, so one of the facts that I found, this is from Border Patrol's website directly. Customs Border Patrol has one of the largest law enforcement explorer programs in the federal government. And these explorer programs are the recruitment tailored to 14 and 20-year-olds to work with dedicated law enforcement professionals throughout their formative years. So we are talking about recruiting children as young as 14 years old to start thinking of joining Border Patrol or other law enforcement agencies. And similar, some of our listeners might remember being in high school and going outside for a quick field trip because, military came and wanted to show off their gear and whatnot. And so oftentimes they also do go into our high schools. And again, with high schools, as many of you know, most of the times people are immature. We're not 18 yet. We're not even old enough to drive, drink, make really big life decisions. And yet we are having these entities coming into our high schools and starting to build that relationship. And oftentimes these agencies will also ask the student for their information, whether it's their phone number, their email, and they constantly call to ask if they are interested in possibly joining or if they want more information, if they want to come into an information session, for example. So more often than not, they are also lured with the incentives of receiving those big bonuses when signing on to joining the military, joining the Navy, whatever it is, or they get the promise for a paid college education in the near future. And as you mentioned, Prima, right before this, this is often done because they know the circumstances that we are often in, which is the lack of financial stability that a lot of our community members are in. As you mentioned, some of the students are unable, to go into college right after. They need to work or they need that money. And so it's understandable, but we also have to look into their tactics and what it means in the long run. And we'll be talking about it more, but those are some of the recruitment tactics that we see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do also want to point out that when President Bush passed under his administration, it was his initiative, but his administration passed the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. Every single person enrolled at a public high school get their information sent to the U.S. military, and so that was the requirement that came with that act. And so, oftentimes, the U.S. military uses this information to recruit students in low-income areas who are more likely to join the military because of the benefits that you mentioned. Prima. It's the ability to be able to maybe get their education paid for in many ways. And I'm not 100% sure if this is still happening right now, but in many ways, individuals were also able to create a path to residency for their parents by joining the US military as well. And so it's important to know, as you mentioned, these individuals, their frontal cortex is not developed yet, and so they are really being put in this very vulnerable position, especially when it comes to those low income areas as well. So what we begin to see since the end of the draft, and now because all military is volunteer based, now we really have began to see these different tactics. I also do want to mention that there are campaigns that are very, very, very specific to our Latinx community. Most recently in 2017, according to the Pew Research, there was a campaign called Yo Soy el Army, and this was propaganda that specifically targeted Hispanic populations. We begin to see that these campaigns and these recruitment tactics are working because as of 2017, that same Pew Research shows us that 43% of our active force military individuals are people of color, of which 36% identified as Hispanic. And one more thing that I do want to talk about that was very, very recent. Congressman from Indiana, Jim Banks, he was really opposed to President Biden forgiveness of educational debt. because he said student loan forgiveness undermines one of our military's greatest recruitment tools at a time of dangerously low enlistment. So, in other words, if college and healthcare become more affordable, then there isn't as many enlistments. And so to be able to create predatory economic practices is a way in which we get susceptible individuals into the forces. So that is, again, a quote by Congressman Jim Banks, a Republican from Indiana. So now let's go ahead and look into the requirements. So now we know their tactics, we know how they're getting recruited, how those recruiters are making everything sound like it's filled with roses and this is an easy path forward. What are the requirements? Why is it so easy to get into these different law enforcements? And I'm going to clarify right here because I think that a lot of individuals that go through either the vetting process for custom enforcement or regular law enforcement. I have, friends personally who have gone through that vetting process. I understand that at that time, that vetting process seems very difficult and very intense. And I understand that. But we also have to have the perspective that these are people whose lives are going to be in their hands. They are carrying a gun and they are often given tactical training to use. And so when we think about that vetting process versus a surgeon, or versus even someone that's just going to go 4 years to college and get their bachelor's degree, we're talking about a 6-month process as opposed to a 4 year. I mean, even an associate's degree, a 2 year process. So, again, two things can be true at once. Individuals going through this process can feel really nervous about the vetting process, but at the same time, we can also acknowledge that that process is not long enough for what it is that they are doing. So, requirements to become, for an example, an ICE agent, and this is directly from the ICE website. They must be a citizen. They must have a valid driver's license. They must be eligible to carry a firearm, and they previous experience in primary law enforcement position is considered. And so once they go through that process, they need to successfully complete a law enforcement training. For males born after December 31st, 1959, they must be registered for selective service. They must pass the background check and take a 3-part fitness test and pass a drug test. And then it didn't necessarily go into detail about the medical requirements. It just says must possess emotional and mental stability. Like, how are they proving this? What is it that they're doing to demonstrate emotional and mental stability? Also, are they going through any bias training? There's so much here. So now that we know recruitment tactics, now that we know what are those requirements, as I read those requirements, there is no need for GPA requirement. There is no need for an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. So, in many ways, this is an opportunity for individuals who may have not excelled in formal education in high school that are still looking for a good paying job. So, again, that opens that door. So now at this point, folks have been recruited, they have joined the force. Now, what type of training or lack of training are these new members receiving? And a second part to it is how does that training that they're receiving speak to our culture's internal machismo and misogyny?
Thank you so much, Prima, for bringing it up for us. As far as training, on average, diversity training constitutes only 0.78% of the overall basic police training programs. So we're talking about the police academy specifically. Now, obviously, these are extremely low hours. It constitutes to about 5 hours of the overall training that they have to complete within the 6 months. As you know, Priva, it's not enough hours to be able to fully grasp what diversity truly means and what it is. I mean, for me personally, it wasn't until I got to college where I started to really learn what it meant and how it plays within the systems that we live in. It's really interesting because police departments within the articles I was reading, they often state that they do not have sufficient funding, but the police force within the United States actually holds about $1.8 billion dollars in military gear. And military gear, as we know, and as we are seeing currently, is often being used against the people protesting for their rights to be respected. And the police is currently using all of this $1 billion worth military gear against the people. And so not only are the police not being trained properly, they are also using, right, the violence to uphold these systems and repress their own people. And I do want to mention within DEI specifically, I do want to highlight gender because it's estimated that at least 40% of police officer families will experience domestic violence. And this study from the National Center for Women and Policing also mentioned that the way that the departments handle these cases are often in an informal way. And so most likely there will not be an official report, there won't be an investigation. And so we're talking about a system here that has so much money and yet it lacks the number one training that is needed in order. And as for border patrol, there was actually a report by the American Immigration Council that exposed how cadets are trained to use blatant racism, which again is teaching them dehumanizing terms, and they are often encouraged to view migrants as others. There's a systemic culture that fosters this violent behavior towards specific ethnic minorities. So as far as training, it's oftentimes just the basics. Most likely it's just scenarios, but it does not constitute DEI whatsoever in most of these training programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about like, we're in California, which is, pretty diverse. And as you mentioned, like it took us to be in college for us to really understand diversity into the level of systemic oppression, but also just systematic views of the world in our, capitalist society. Now, it makes me think like if places like California and New York are very diverse, and a lot of individuals oftentimes experience that diversity through culture, food, and so on and so forth. But then it makes me think about the states in the Midwest that have way less diversity. And a lot of the times when they are relocated to different areas in the US where maybe there is more diversity, they don't know how to interact with individuals because they've never been exposed to that. And now all of a sudden they're being exposed to that where, you know, their unconscious or conscious racial bias is kicking in as their fight or flight is also kicking in. And that does not end. So tell me, Prima, how are we beginning to see this lack of training or this lack of knowledge when it comes to our officers, our law enforcement? How are we seeing that lack of training translate into the real world?
So I think it's important, Prima, to mention how it's been years since the police really came to be, and there has been very little change within the training that they have. So I wanted to briefly mention the history behind it because I think it's really important to really comprehend it. And that was with the form of patrolling slaves. So to ensure that they maintained the slave society, they created these jobs where the whites were now patrolling the slaves, and it was their policing back in the day. Later on, when the Ku Klux Klan came to be, they actually worked with police to also uphold white supremacy during the civil rights movement. That is where we see that the police is constantly inflicting violence on communities of color. And now we are seeing police work with ICE and DHS to separate families and violently put human beings within these inhumane detention centers. And we won't show the infinite reports, right? The numbers on the detention center specific violations on human rights. But it is a fact, right, that these and some ICE agents and police say and will continue to say that they're following orders. However, that does not mean that it is right. And so I do also wanted to highlight how Right now, a lot of police departments will be collaborating with ICE and DHS. And I wanted to give the example of LA because many of our listeners might not know, but I was actually there when it first started to hit really bad a couple weeks ago in LA. And I was on the ground trying to assist. And LA itself is actually a sanctuary city. So, what this means is that the police cannot collaborate with ICE or DHS in arresting people or even being present. However, even with it being a sanctuary city, we did see various videos. There's various people as witness that LAPD was in fact present during these raids. So I really want to put it out there for those who are thinking into going into law enforcement what this really means because as we're seeing now there is this collaboration happening and if you are in the department what are you going to do? We are seeing our own community members being taken from us. So really thinking about again the long term of you being in these positions. And so continuing with the violence, within a 2024 report, there were only 10 days last year when police were not known to have taken a life, is how I will phrase that. And it only gets worse because the police use of force is now the sixth leading cause of death for Black men, which is huge. Furthermore, there is actually the state of California has a Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training that does publish the names of many officers whose certification has been suspended or revoked for various reasons. I do want to say that this website specifically only dates back to 2023, so it's not too far back. And there are plenty of officers who have also been revoked of their certification to be police officers for egregious acts, which we will not get into, but they happen. So talking back again, Prima, about the violence and specifically the internal machismo, I think that itself speaks volume to the machismo that is within these systems themselves. And I do want to mention that there is a police union. This is the oldest and largest police labor organization in the United States. They actually did endorse Donald Trump in both the 2016 and 2020 election. So this specific organization, we're talking about 700,000 police officers who majority supported Donald Trump. And for those who might not be, again, familiar with ongoing political issues, Donald Trump has been the president to voice his opposition for Black Lives Matter, his opposition for immigrants as a whole, whether you're a first generation, whether you're a second generation, this is just a fact. And, we are talking about a person who has been convicted of 34 felony counts. Again, that is a fact. We are not stating anything that is not true. And so we're talking about people who have sworn to uphold the law and who have at the same time voted to support a convicted felon. And turning again back into this internal machismo, 85% of police officers are men. That speaks to the connection between these specific agencies and the internal machismo that is ongoing.
Absolutely. And so when we kind of come back and connect it to our theme of today of like, how are we losing our young men, of brown men, Latinx men into specific law enforcement, whether it be police academy or ICE or, DHS, Border Patrol, whatever that may be. A lot of the times that machismo in the culture and in their household is one that now is validated in their place of work. And that becomes extremely dangerous because now, as we know, we learn and we gain knowledge through different cultures. And one of the best ways in which folks can get this specific exposure of different race, ethnicity, theories is through formal education. And I know both you and I have done our very best to ensure that we are validating all paths of life, including lived experiences for individuals who chose to go into the workforce and not formal education. And I think that in this case, I think we're going to show a little bit of bias to formal education. Formal education teaches critical thinking and it exposes students to other students from different parts of life. I work at a higher education institution and we are in the process of admitting our first year students into our living learning community. And just within my roster, I'm able to see that I have, 14 women identifying and 11 male identifying and 5 non binary individuals. We're going to bring those individuals together. They're going to live together their first year in the same floor. Now, at the end of that first year, they're going to come out knowing the experiences of their classmates, understanding for the religions and the cultures of other individuals. This is what formal education does. And so when we kind of look at what is happening in terms of the gaps of formal education, it's so important for us to take a look at it because there is a big gap with our individual or our young men of color. So according to the American Institute for Boys and Men, in 2022, women were 9 percentage points more likely to enroll in college the fall after high school. So now, right now, currently, there is 2.4 million more females than males in undergraduate in college campuses doing their undergraduate degree. Additionally, when we look at the percentage, men are less likely to complete their college degree. The 4-year graduation rate for women is 54%, while for men, we're at 43%. And then the gender gap is even wider for Black and Hispanic men. So when we kind of take all of this into consideration, we are really realizing that our young Hispanic men are falling behind in formal education. There is this big gap, and it's not an opinion, it is a fact. But in addition to that, maybe they are still expected to be the providers of their families. And so when they begin to think, okay, what do I do now to get a good job and bring that stability, joining the military, joining DHS, all of those sound really good when the sign-on bonus is $10,000, when the process is 6 months versus 2 years for an associate's degree or even a technical certification, let alone a 4-year university and then 6 years for an advanced degree. So really, like, that's where we are losing our young men. And that is why we are currently facing a lonely male epidemic that is happening right now. There are so many women, especially Gen Z and younger millennials, that are choosing not to date men because they're just way more overqualified and have more assets than the counterparts. And heterosexual women are choosing to remain single because a partnership with a male currently right now does not bring them more prosperity or even more enrichment. And so that brings us to the present day. So we know that application is one way in which we increase those critical thinking skills and also strengthen our empathy muscles, because when we are exposed to different sides of history and different areas of study that we didn't even know existed, it'll allow us to have a clear view of our world. And that always comes with increased empathy. And empathy is not for the weak people. To be able to express empathy actually requires a lot of strength. So that's one of the things that we can do. Another thing that we did, Prima, is we asked our followers on Instagram, what is it that they are doing for folks that are raising a young man or helping? So even if they're not the parent or the birthing parent, if they're helping raising young men of color, how do they make sure that they not learn the machismo patterns? So what do we hear from our followers?
So some of them actually shared quite a lot. We had one person who shared that they make sure to teach their own son that emotions are seen and are valid, which I think is really important, Prima, to combat that machismo of men don't cry, right? It is okay not to be okay, and it is okay to cry it out sometimes. Sometimes that's all we need. Another parent shared that they try to model both parents doing the cooking and the cleaning. So it doesn't just fall on the mother or on the sister. Everybody in the household is helping out with the chores. This isn't about, it's a woman's job or the mom has to do it. This is genuinely a life skill to learn how to cook and clean. Another person shared how their son has a toy kitchen and they actually help in the real one because cooking and caring for others aren't gendered tasks.
I love it. So just a few thoughts of, how we can ensure that we are breaking those generational cycles. We are the generation to do that. And so that's all we have for you all, primos and primas. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. It was a challenging one for us because it's very near and dear to our heart. It's happening right now. I will say, speaking for myself, that it was a little bit of a challenge for me as well because I have two close friends that are in law enforcement as well, and as I mentioned previously, my personal stance is two things can be true at once. So, we can acknowledge that these agencies are not doing the proper training and they are not necessarily putting the well-being of the civilians who they're supposed to serve first as much as they are the quotas or maybe whatever it is that the orders coming from above are coming down. But it's also true to know that there are families who have individuals in these forces that worry about them. And a lot of the times, those individuals are people of color. Both things can be true at once. And so for me, this was particularly a challenging one, but it is one that I firmly believe that it's important for us to have that conversation. And these two individuals will probably listen to this podcast as they are patrolling. And that is okay because we've had this conversation multiple times. And so I hope that this conversation brings constructive feedback and opens up ideas for individuals across the aisle and individuals that maybe have a different perspective. Whatever that perspective is, it is an important conversation to have because it's not going anywhere. So, with that being said, Prima, do you have any palabras de sabiduría?
I do, Prima. My palabras de sabiduría come from one of my favorite feminist authors, Roxane Gay. She says, silent gives consent. When we say nothing, when we do nothing, we are consenting to these trespasses against us. And I think this goes to both what we talked about, all of the injustices happening, and with the current raids. I know a lot of people oftentimes feel guilty of not being able to go in person to help, but there are various ways to help. And so this is also kind of like a call to action. If you are unable to go in person, believe it or not, social media can be very powerful. It can actually help uplift the voices of those on the ground. You can always share a video and ensure that there is more awareness happening. And you can always donate too if you have the ability to do so. So that is my palabra de sabiduría. It's just really, I think, really, really powerful during these times. Silent gives consent. So let's make sure that we are, speaking up, taking a stand. And yeah, on to you, Prima. Do you have any palabras de sabiduría today?
Alrighty. Yes, I do. I wish I would have thought of something that was very similar to you within the theme of today's podcast, but I didn't. I thought of something that is, I think, a little bit more broad. I know that we are going through a really tough time as a country, financially, and I know that the job markets are really difficult for a lot of individuals. I know a lot of people have just graduated in May and in June, especially students that I have at my institution that are probably listening. Shout out to them. So this is just a quick little reminder. My palabras de sabiduría today are going to be little things make big things happen. So a lot of the times we feel like we are in the same place or that we are not advancing as quickly as we wanted to. It's important for us to know that in order for those big things to happen, we make those little things happen first, and that is okay. So with that being said, thank you so much for listening to us. We do have our final remarks. This podcast is brought to you by Andrea and Jack. It is co-hosted, co-produced, co-directed, and co-edited by both Andrea and Jack. Social media and outreach is done by Jack. Research on discussed topics is done by both Primas, and sources can be found in our link tree. We aim to make our platform nonpartisan. In the case of an opinion being expressed by either, those opinions belong solely to the person who expressed that opinion. For accessibility features on the podcast, please visit our YouTube channel for captions and script of the episode. And just like that, Prima, where can folks find us on social media?
Yeah, we always welcome all of our followers to follow us on Instagram at Ponle Acento Podcast. Feel free to send us a DM if you wish to see a specific episode touch on a specific topic. And you can also follow us on TikTok as well at Ponle Acento Podcast, or you can also email us at ponleacento.podcast@gmail.com.
And that is a wrap. The next time that you'll hear from us, it'll be our grand finale for our season one, Ponle Acento. So we do have a treat for our next episode. It is going to be mainly in Spanish. I think we may sprinkle in some Spanglish in there, but it is going to be a challenge by choice for both Jack and I. We are going to talk about bilingualism and language justice. Y lo vamos a hacer en español para que lo puedan entender nuestros familiares. So join us next time. And with that, take care of yourself, drink your water, and go to sleep early.